Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and thank you to my fellow speakers, Edward, Simon and John. Now, we do have a very big challenge before us, and CIB, the Campaign for an Independent Britain, which I'm proud to say I'm a member of, a committee member of, and my organisation, the Bruges Group, is affiliated to the CIB. The CIB will play an important part in that campaign, and they've been really at the forefront since the 1960s. They have been flying the flag for British independence, because that is really the question that we're facing, one of Britain becoming a self-governing democracy once again, rather than being run by the institutions of the European Union. And that's very important, because we must keep pushing the case for British withdrawal. I believe that talk about reforming the EU and renegotiation is a distraction that is wasting time. Every moment of the day we must be talking about why the EU is damaging this country and why we must get out. Talking about renegotiation and reforming the EU is really playing into David Cameron's hands, because he knows, as Simon mentioned, that option is more popular. And whilst we're playing his game, we're not convincing the British public that it's actually not only fine to get out of the EU, but it's actually absolutely imperative. Now, we do actually, in my opinion, have our work cut out, and the opinion polls back this up. The latest British social attitude survey looking at Europe, or the issue of the European Union rather, well, it's found that most British people actually think that the EU is very good for protecting workers' rights. Actually, a lot of those rights do actually originate from the International Labour Organization, which sits above the EU. It's a UN-affiliated group. It was established after the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Also, 69%, according to the Social Attitude Survey, think that the right to work for British people in other EU countries is a good thing. According to this survey as well, 57% of the public support staying in the EU, and 35%, only 35% want to get out. That's according to this poll. There's other opinion polls which I'll come on to later, which show that actually the stay-in side are currently ahead. That's why we really do have our work cut out. Other results from this survey are that 35% thinks that membership of the EU makes us stronger economically. Of course, 42% thinks it makes no difference, but 17% thinks it makes us weaker. But the stronger side, the side that thinks the EU is benefiting our economy, has more than twice the support of those who think it's damaging. And this is very relevant to, if we are going to face a referendum, how we deal with that referendum and how we tackle these arguments or these misconceptions that many people do have. Also, the question of influence. 29% think the EU gives us greater influence in the world. Of course, 56% thinks it makes no difference, but 12%, only 12% thinks it gives us less influence. Now again, that is more than twice supporting the idea of the European Union giving us more influence than, of course, those thinking it gives us less influence. So again, we are really up against it, and we're fighting a very important battle for our independence. And if we are given a referendum, it must be won, because if we lose it, don't think there'll be any Devo Max for the UK. Don't think there'll be concessions made to Britain. If we lose a referendum, it will be taken as our tacit support, even overt support for the European project, perhaps even more European integration. We must win a referendum, because we know what happened in 1975. The referendum was lost, and of course, we're still in the EU to this very day. It may be a generation changer. One opportunity, if there is to be a referendum, could actually consign much discussion about the EU for a whole generation until, of course, hopefully would win in the long run. But it's a big threat that we're facing. Now, of course, my colleague John spoke about what should we do? What would be our strategy? How exactly do we get out the EU? Well, I think I have some ideas. That really rests upon rejoining the European Free Trade Association as an interim step to a wider solution of separating ourselves and from the whole project of the European Union, and of course really undermining it from from being a member of the European Free Trade Association. That would mean that Britain is out. I think this is very important because, of course, there is these scare stories that are continually spread about what leaving the EU means. We hear about the 3 million jobs myth being repeated. We know that is complete bunkum. But, of course, they keep on repeating it. And, of course, the CIB has produced publications tackling that myth, exposing it, but it's still being repeated by the media. And not everybody's fully engaged with political issues, let alone European issues. And if they keep on hearing, 3 million jobs would be lost if we left the EU, 3 million jobs are dependent upon membership of the European Union, well, that may have a big effect when it comes to a referendum, if indeed we do ever get one. We know how in 1975 businesses were warning people about leaving the EU. We've seen those same scare stories. They're using fear to try and keep us in the European Union. They're using the uncertainty of what coming out means. And until we have a unified message, there would be uncertainty because the stay in the EU, they have their clear message, stay in. They'll change the EU, they'll reform the EU. They've taken over the language of reform. They'll promise it's going to get better. Cameron will produce, if indeed he is Prime Minister after the next election, we'll see about that, he'll produce some minor changes. As Edward mentioned, it may already be agreed with Chancellor Merkel in Germany. And indeed, actually, a lot of the changes David Cameron has spoke about can actually quite easily be achieved under what's known as a simplified revision procedure in Article 48 on the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, where the meeting of heads of government can quickly change a treaty as long as it relates to what's known as Part 3 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. Now, of course, that is the area which immigration falls into, and UKIP have managed to confuse the issue of the EU membership with immigration. And of course, that's what David Cameron will try and get some changes on. Indeed, currently, even in the EU, there are actions that a British government could take to deal with the immigration issue. He just chooses not to. But Germany is already taking action against benefit tourism. It can be done already. So David Cameron just needs to shore up the treaties somewhat, and he will claim some big victory, and then, well, perhaps he would win the referendum. And of course, they would use the fear, the uncertainty, and the doubt about leaving to keep Britain in. That's why we have to deal with that fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And one of the other tactics that the Europhiles use is to confuse the issue of EU membership with membership of the single market, or what's otherwise known as the internal market in Eurospeak. Now, actually, they're two different things, but they've confused the issues of trade and the single market with one of being members of the EU. So we've got to address that. Otherwise, well, we could be facing defeat. Now, in my opinion, the best way to win that referendum would be to advocate that we can reframe the debate. It's not so much about leaving the European Union or leaving the single market. It's about rejoining the European Free Trade Association. Behavioural economics shows that people do not like losing something. If you say we'll lose our access or our membership of the single market, instinctively they will not like it. Yes, there's maybe lots of problems with the single market. It may not work as well as what many would hope. But people automatically do not like losing something, whether that's influence in the EU or being part of the single market. So we must tackle that. We've got to tackle the 3 million jobs myth. We've got to show that trade will continue on the day after we vote to leave, just as it would before. We've got to reassure businesses that they would still have their full input into perhaps many of the working groups that develop the rules of the single market and decide how it governs. That's one of the reasons why big businesses support the EU. They have a lot of influence. That's why people like Richard Branson and Martin Sorrell are put front and centre by the BBC because, of course, big business, when it talks, often a lot of people do listen, even though they may have their own vested interests. But their vested interests are serving Britain's EU membership at this moment in time. So we've got to deal with that. We have to reassure these people that Britain would still be fully engaged from the business side with the European Union, or the single market rather. And we need to have a speedy solution, one that can get us out of the European Union quickly. Negotiating a trade agreement with the EU would take between 5 and 10 years. There is not one agreement that the EU has made with another country that has taken less than 5 years to make. Often they take 10 years. Switzerland, with its negotiating its agreements, took 16 years, and that was building upon previous trade agreements. If you say to people, well, we'll leave the European Union and it will take us a dozen years at least, perhaps more, if ever, to agree the kind of deal that we would want, the people, quite simply, will not vote for it. There is, in my opinion, one option that we should go for, that we need to unite behind, which is only a transitional arrangement. It's not the final destination, but that is that we would rejoin EFTA and remain in what's known as the European Economic Area, which is the single market, and use that as the base towards forming a new trade agreement, which would, of course, ultimately take time, but it would protect Britain's goodwill, it would give us influence. We would be outside of the European Union, but we can say to businesses, trade will continue just as it was before. We will have full access to the single market, which is what people want. People don't like the political side of the EU, but they like the trade links. So that would guarantee us, it would give us a winning message. Ultimately, of course, the way to do this is that we would issue an Article 50 notification. That is the only way to force Brussels to the negotiating table. We'd have exit talks based on retaining European Economic Area membership. We're already a member of the European Economic Area. We're a member of the EU and the separate European Economic Area, which is an agreement between the EU and the European Free Trade Association. It is what basically people talk as the Norway option or the Norwegian option. We need the EU support for continuing third country trade links because, of course, we've been in the EU now for over 40 years. They've been negotiating our trade deals with other countries for that time. It's not been done by British people, and if we leave the EU, many of those agreements would fall. Of course, they can be resurrected in time, but there's actually more than 200 of these agreements which apply to the UK, and it ranges from goods and services to, of course, even air passenger rules. We cannot have uncertainty upon leaving. People will not vote for it. So if we need the EU support to have those trade links, to keep those treaties alive, that would give us access to so many different areas. We'd rejoin EFTA, and that way it would allow us to keep membership of the European Economic Area, and ultimately there would be a rebalancing of power between the EU and EFTA. Originally, it was envisaged that the European Free Trade Association and the European Community, as it was then, when they were originally deciding about having the European Economic Area, it was one of an agreement between equals. The agreement was actually described, it was actually envisaged by Jacques Delors in 17th of January 1989, where he talked about Europe being a village. And in that village, the European Community was just one house. And then there was other organisations such as the European Free Trade Association, and they would have a single market which would allow everybody to trade easily throughout the European Union, and gave those trade advantages to countries such as Norway and Switzerland that were originally going to join, but without them having to take part within political union. Of course, things changed, the Berlin Wall collapsed, and they decided to expand the EU, and the impetus for a partnership of equals between EFTA and the European Community, or the European Union as it now is, changed. But originally the idea was a very good one, and it can be restored. There can be balance again between those entities, European Free Trade Association and the European Community, if there's bigger countries that were to leave the EU, such as Britain, and rejoin EFTA. And then ultimately, what we need to work for, in my opinion, is a post-EU Europe. As soon as Britain comes out of the EU, other countries may well follow, and the whole project of European centralisation could well radically change. Whenever a country wants to have decentralisation, it always creates a process where other states within a political entity want even more decentralisation, and that can become unstoppable. We see how the Scottish Parliament has led to more calls for more decentralisation in Wales, with the Welsh Assembly getting more power. Now remember, when the Welsh Assembly was originally established, they only won the campaign to have a Welsh Assembly by as little as, I think it was 50,000 votes, a relative handful of votes out of 5 million people. Yet, of course, now they're talking about more powers for the Welsh Assembly. As soon as Britain comes out, other countries may follow. Ireland, Denmark, even Denmark. There was an opinion poll in Denmark several years ago that said most Danish people would actually rather EFTA membership to EU membership. This is the European village, and the European Union is just one small part of it. There's other trade agreements, other opportunities that Britain can exploit, and the European Economic Area is just one of those, along with the EFTA states of Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. Now, of course, often we talk about, well, we should just leave the EU and have a free trade agreement. Well, the European Union and free trade is somewhat actually of a myth. The EU seeks to export its regulations. Often its trade agreements want to have other countries adopt the acquis communautaire. The EU requires bureaucratic compliance when trading with it. There's rules that have to be complete, rules of origin that have to be followed. There needs to be various forms that need to be completed. Agreements demand compliance with international standards. I'll come on to that later. And really, for the EU, trade is often politics by other means. Many of the trade agreements that the EU has made recently with other nations, particularly developing nations, seek to export its environmental standards and human rights standards, as well as making sure that other countries follow some of the rules that it applies in terms of its own sort of health and safety rules and so forth. But it is not straightforward establishing a trade agreement with the European Union. And actually, the international system for deciding trade rules is actually a lot more complicated than some would have us believe. Now, if there are issues to do with leaving the EU and problems, a designated port of entry needs to be agreed. Now, of course, under WTO rules, there has to be one established, but there still needs to be an agreement put in place. If we left the EU, there is no agreement for us to fall back on. So there have to be a whole series of negotiations which would take time, and the other side will exploit this. There would be tariffs. They would automatically apply. In some areas, they're next to nothing. In some areas, they are nothing. But in considerable numbers of areas, tariffs are relevant, such as in cars. And if we left the EU without a trade agreement, just following the WTO, then, of course, there would be tariffs. As I mentioned earlier, there would have to be rules of origin to complete for importers. There's the threat of anti-dumping action, which is where if the EU argues that goods are being sold into the EU at lower than the price they should be, then they can threaten anti-dumping action, tax the exporter to the EU, or even just threaten them, and that forces their prices to go up. Professor Minford argues this amounts to a common manufacturing policy. That is a threat because the EU often takes anti-dumping action against, say, exporters from China, such as Chinese solar panels, for instance. There's only really one way of guaranteeing that anti-dumping action isn't taken, and that is to really be in the European Economic Area where there's a mechanism where you can deal with such issues to make sure that these things are less likely. Again, that will worry businesses if there's a threat of anti-dumping action. We need to reassure businesses. There's also another problem with leaving the EU. It doesn't grant access to the single market in services. That only applies to members of the European Economic Area, such as Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. They have full access to the EU services market. This is very important because for the British economy, trade in services is massively in surplus. Trade in goods is, of course, in deficit, but in services, particularly for the City of London, they would not want us to withdraw and we would lose access to the services market of the EU. We'd also, if we left, the EU without an agreement such as one established around the European Economic Area, we'd lose access to the EU's procurement market, or open market in procurement, which is worth around 16 trillion euros. It's a massive, massive business, public procurement within the European Union and the European Economic Area. British businesses would not want to be isolated from that. They'd want the opportunity to compete, but unless they're in the European Economic Area, that would be denied to them. And of course, EU, as I mentioned earlier, EU negotiated trade deals, many of those with third countries would be void if we left. We really do need the European Economic Area to persuade businesses that everything will be fine when we're out. And of course, there's conditionality. The EU does want many of its standards to be followed. Now, as I mentioned, there's soft support for exit. There's not a significant margin. We're not far enough ahead in the polls to guarantee victory in any referendum. In fact, at the moment, of course, it does swing. We're currently behind. And that's before a campaign of fear has really got underway. The date of the referendum, as Edward mentioned, is timed to coincide with the British presidency of the EU, when they'll pretend that Britain is finally leading in negotiations in Brussels and winning. The timing is against us because David Cameron is setting the agenda and he supports EU membership. That's why he's doing a referendum at a time when he's most likely to win it, if indeed he is Prime Minister. And of course, as Simon mentioned, the middle way alternative of reforming the terms of EU membership is the most popular option. And that's exactly what David Cameron's trying to do. He's trying to pretend that the EU is going to change more to suit British needs, and most people would actually vote for that. And of course, there's a tendency to yay say in a referendum. And of course, the referendum question would be one of asking whether you want Britain to stay in the European Union. Do you want Britain to stay in the European Union? Most people like to be positive and like to say yes. The question is against us as well. We really do have our work cut out. And this shows some stats, again, about coming out. 57% would favour staying in if there's a renegotiated terms of EU membership, with just 22% wanting to come out. David Cameron knows this. These arguments have been presented to him that if he can argue that the EU will now better suit Britain, that he's managed to change things, that the public will overwhelmingly vote for that. We really do, again, as I mentioned before, have our work cut out. And again, this is another opinion poll which shows that actually at this moment in time, this is from October 2014, most, again, favour staying in the European Union. This interestingly shows that support for the EU is actually directly proportional to the feel-good factor. And when people are feeling more hopeful about the economy, then they're less Eurosceptic. And this, another poll, again, shows that the work is cut out. And recent opinion polls also show the same. That's why I think we need to reframe the debate, asking people not to so much to consider leaving the European Union. That would be our game, that would be our goal, that's what we're trying to achieve, but making it seem that we're not leaving the single market, we're not leaving the trade links. That's why the Bruges Group conducted an opinion poll. What would you prefer to be a member of, the EU or EFTA? And 71%, as opposed to 29%, said they favoured that option. That is, in my opinion, the winning argument, because it deals with the issues of trade. It deals with a lot of the problems that the Europhiles will throw at us. And the support is uniform across all political supporters for the option of joining EFTA. Now, there's other alternatives that have been discussed. The Swiss option, well, that's composed of 120 bilateral agreements. That's very complex. It took decades to agree. Even the EU finds it too bureaucratic. There's a lack of mutual recognition. That's difficult for exporters. It does not give access to the single market in services. It take many years to agree. And the EU doesn't favour the Swiss option. It's not an option at all. There's also the Turkish option of remaining in the customs union. Well, Turkey no longer supports it. They find it an absolute affront to their country. There's a lack of mutual recognition of goods and services. And the customs union does not allow for other trade agreements to be reached. that, again, is not an option. It seems that the off-the-shelf options that are readily available, the only one that is really workable is, of course, the option of rejoining the European Free Trade Association and remaining in the European Economic Area. And that is about leaving the political union but keeping the economic links. That's what the British public want. That is the only really way I think we can win a referendum. Membership of EFTA allows membership of the single market. Now, it is actually possible to restrict immigration within the European Economic Area. I know in the EEA treaty it talks about the free movement of persons. If you read the regulations that govern how that works, there are actually a whole host of restrictions. There does not grant automatic right to residency. Those coming in would need to register with the police or with competent authorities, usually that is with the police. They would not have the right to social security. They would have to be able to support themselves. How many people coming from Romania and Bulgaria have the sufficient funds to support themselves? And that level is actually, that have to be above the requirement of where people no longer get social security in this country. I believe that's around 18,000 or 16 or 18,000 pounds before they could be given residency. So really in the EEA, it is about the free movement of workers and those who can support themselves, not about the free movement of persons. It's just the governments of all persuasions within the European Union support the free movement of peoples, and anyone can go anywhere more or less willy-nilly. That's what the governments have allowed. But it doesn't have to be that way within the EEA if a country so chooses. Being in EFTA guarantees trade and encourages investment. There's a whole host of economic stats that I could show you that actually show that EFTA countries are a lot better off in almost every measure than members of the European Union. They have their right to make own trade agreements, and actually the majority of EEA relevant rules are determined above the EU by specialised UN agencies. We talk about the EU and regulating. Most of these rules that we talk about, that we think come from the European Union, do not actually originate from the EU. I'll come on to that later. And also there's another misconception about membership of the European Economic Area that I'd like to address. It's often said that EFTA EEA countries have to pay money to the EU. That is not really quite correct. There is something known as EEA or Norway grants, but this is not money handed over to the EU. The Norway grants are administered by the Norwegian Foreign Office, and this is about spending to reduce inequality within the single market, and it goes towards supporting less well-off countries or projects administered by Norway, who is, of course, the major country within the EEA and it goes towards supporting projects within Eastern Europe and those countries that are less well off and dealing with inequality there. It does not go to the EU, but it does have to be made under an agreement. It's part of the EEA agreement, but it has to be negotiated. It is not one that automatically applies. There is not a Danegeld that's having to be paid. There is also money that's paid by EFTA members that are in the EEA towards the European Union, such as the European research projects, but that's actually something Norway is a net benefit of, such as the Erasmus project as well. That's also an area. So really the EU is not forcing EFTA countries to pay the money. Where there's a service that's supplied by the EU, then of course Norway would pay for that, just as like Israel belongs to the Erasmus project, such as Switzerland belongs to that. So of course money is paid to the EU for those services, but it is not a tax on countries that want to belong to the European Economic Area that are not in the EU. They are not being forced to make payments that they do not want to make. So that's just one thing that needs to be corrected, because it is misunderstood by many Eurosceptics as well. Now, I mentioned earlier about the international system of lawmaking. This is, of course, far too complicated for you to see, but it just goes to show that we talk about the EU being a burden upon us and how it's forcing us to adopt many business regulations and how that's a cost towards businesses. Well, actually, there's a whole system that sits above the European Union where these rules are decided, such as the World Trade Organization, which is trying to create harmonization of standards to alleviate technical barriers to trade. There's the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. There's the World Forum for the harmonization of motor vehicle standards. There's a whole host of these bodies, the International Labour Organization, making rules which govern how we live our lives. And these are automatically adopted by the European Union, which is then imposed by the EU on its member states. So if we left the EU, arguably, we would still be following a lot of these rules. Now, one of them is the Cucumber Directive. We heard a lot about how the EU is making rules about making sure that cucumbers are straight. That's actually a United Nations Economic Commission for Europe regulation. So if we left the EU, we're members of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, it would still apply. Nothing would change substantially in terms of regulation. There would not be a bonfire of the regulations if we left the EU, because Britain is fully engaged with these bodies. We're a member of these organisations. They have been agreed internationally. They will still they'll still apply the day we leave the European Union. The difference would be is at the moment we're in the EU, we don't have our own voice on these bodies. We don't have our own representation within the World Trade Organization on these other international bodies that determine the rules. We have to follow an agreed EU line when we're negotiating what global standards are. But here's a very good example of global bodies as well. There's the OECD, Basel, the WTO, the UN, the Financial Stability Board, the Bank of International Settlements. The list is endless. That's how financial service rules are made. They're not actually made by the European Union. We hear a lot about how the EU could be a threat to the City of London. Well, actually, the rules are made above the EU, and if we left, they would apply just as before. It would not. The regulation argument is, of course, really somewhat of a red herring, and it's something that we could potentially trip up on because most people in this country favour many of these regulations. When it comes to the rules that are relevant to the European Economic Area, there's really, currently 6,000 of them. It is a fraction of the rules for the European Union as a whole. If we left the EU, what would continue is EEA relevant rules, which are mainly technical and exist to eliminate technical barriers to trade, to make sure it's easier for countries to trade well between themselves. So really the benefits of EFTA are that EU states are fully engaged with UN standard setting organisations. EFTA states have formal input into the development of the EU. It's an off-the-shelf alternative that does exist at present, and we'd be outside of many of the most damaging areas of the European Union, such as the Common Agricultural Policy, the Common Fisheries Policy, various EU agencies, and of course Justice and Home Affairs. And it offers us a la carte way of engaging with the single market, because you have the right to reject areas where you don't want EU encroachment. The finances are on our side. The trade benefits us greatly. As I mentioned, there's a whole host of economic statistics that show that if we were outside of the EU but a member of the single market, we would be a lot better off. Of course, there's a whole host of trade links, but really, as I mentioned, leaving the EU is not the final step. It would make me very happy indeed, but of course there would still be other negotiations with the European Union. We would hopefully have a new agreement with Brussels, and really rejoining the European Economic Area, or remaining in the European Economic Area and rejoining EFTA, isn't the final step. It's just a platform to a final, better agreement between Britain and the European Union, if indeed it does survive, because it will lead to a realignment of power in Europe. And ultimately, we want to replace the EEA agreement with a new international settlement. So really, in my opinion, if we do have this referendum, which is a way of keeping us in the EU, a way of making the British public vote to staying in, which is also a way that David Cameron has protected his own position as party leader, which was increasingly becoming questionable as he faced challenges from Eurosceptic MPs, and of course a way of trying to stop the growth of the United Kingdom Independence Party. That's why he came up with the referendum pledge, not because he wants to help Eurosceptics, and indeed it's the biggest challenge we could ever face. And if it's lost, it could be another generation until we have another opportunity to get out. That's why we need to be very careful how we handle it, and we need to have a solution, an answer to all the fear, the uncertainty and the doubt, the scare stories that will be thrown at us. And for me, the one option that can win us a referendum, deal with the likes of Richard Branson and Martin Sorrell and the CBI, is of course the EFTA or Norway option, and that will win us a referendum, and then finally we'll be out of the EU and we'll be the masters of our own future once again. Thank you.